Well, good evening, and welcome to today's program brought to you by the U.S. Botanic Garden. My name is Courtney Burris, the online education specialist with the Learning and Outreach team here at the Garden. We are so happy to have you joining us for Terroir of Chocolate, cacao flavor from around the world, an online lecture with ethnobotanist, founder, and flavormeister, Dr. Nat Bletter. Dr. Nat Bletter has 25 years of experience in botany, traveling the world, documenting exotic fruits and vegetables, gathering food in the wild, and exploring herbal and traditional medicine. With his PhD in ethnobotany from the City University of New York and New York Botanical Garden, and his postdoc at University of Hawaii, Manoa, Nat is the founder of artisanal chocolate company Madre Chocolate and runs the edible landscaping company Natty by Nature. Welcome, Dr. Blatter.
Thank you so much for having me, Courtney, and everybody at the
Yes, of
USBG, and
course.
everyone tuning in around the country.
Yes, we can get right
I'm
into it,
excited to
Dr.
talk to
Blatter.
you all about chocolate.
All righty. Yep, let's get it.
So if you haven't, excuse me, if you haven't been to a cacao farm before or seen a cacao tree, they're pretty amazing creatures native to the Amazon, where we think, or at least the earliest evidence that we have, is that they were used not for the seeds, but for the fruit of them. And the fruit start with this tiny little half-inch flower. That's one of the most complicated flowers I've ever seen. I call it the escape room of flowers. So it has all these fake stamens and hoods and trap doors to kind of trick the pollinator. So only they're not pollinated by bees because bees aren't quite smart enough to be able to pollinate, get in through those trap doors. So it requires a tiny little fly called a midge that's related to the houseplant pest thrips, if you have those at home, unfortunately. But they're the only ones that are smart enough to get past these fake stamens that are on the tip of the flower and through the hoods and trapdoors in the back and get to the true stamens to pollinate the flower. And about 5 months after they pollinate it, you'll get these beautiful cacao pods on there that come in all colors of the rainbow, from just about everything, every color besides blue. I have not yet seen a blue cacao pod, but they'll be red, yellow, green, orange, deep maroon or purple. When they go a bit off, they can be brown. So no one has bred a blue one yet, but waiting to see when that happens. And so they can be ripe at many stages, usually more in the red, yellow, orange stage. And there's a scratch test to know when the cacao pods are ripe. And we made up a little song about it so that new and overly excited cacao farmers don't bring us unripe cacao pods, because those don't taste good at all. They don't make good chocolate. So we made up the song or mnemonic: if you see any green in the scratch, leave it for the next batch. So that's the one you see on the left. If you see yellow, orange, or brown, it's time to take the cacao pod down. And this one even has a little smiley face telling us it's ready to go, because there's no green in the image on the right. So once they're ready to go, I'm going to lead you through the 12-step, 2-month process of making chocolate, but just a little overview of what we're going to be looking at, what contributes to the final flavor of chocolate from the start of growing the trees through that 2-month process of turning it into a chocolate bar. Is it based on varieties, other parts of the processing, where they grow, and what contributes to terroir? And I'll define that word in a second. So when you finally have a ripe cacao pod that you've done the scratch test on, if you crack it open, you'll see these 5 rows of cacao beans surrounded by a delicious white pulp. It has the unfortunate botanical name of mucilage because it is related to other things like okra and durian are in the same family, and it does have a little bit of the texture of okra, but it tastes a lot more delicious than either okra or durian. It tastes kind of like lychee or mangosteen, if you've had that, or soursop, guanabana. So sometimes I call cacao pods the poor man's durian, because if you've ever tried to buy mangosteen in the US, it can cost like $10 a fruit, whereas cacao is more like maybe $3 to $5 a pod, and you get a lot more fruit per pod. And it's not until you cut open those seeds that you finally see what becomes the cacao bean in the chocolate, that purple colored seed that you see in the bottom right. And that it's only purple when it's fresh. As soon as you cut it open, it'll start to oxidize, despite all the antioxidants that you've heard about the health effects from in chocolate. So when we cut this open, we send it down the next stage of its journey. So I'll go into that in that processing. And I just wanted to mention, this is why we need ripe cacao pods, because if you cut them down when that scratch test is still green, they will taste like cucumbers instead of mangosteen. So cucumber tasting cacao makes terrible tasting chocolate. I was just warning you about that. I've tried. It's not really salvageable. So I mentioned the 12 steps. First, you got to harvest the fruit. It's all done hand harvesting, because they all ripen at different stages about every 2 weeks during the season, which in Hawaii is about 6 months of the year, from December to May or so, sometimes even longer. And so they can't really be machine harvested, unfortunately. So it's a lot of hand labor that goes into one of the reasons for the high cost of cacao and chocolate. You crack open the fruit to get to that fruit inside, which all gets kind of shucked out and put in a wood bin. And then the most magical part of chocolate making happens at this stage. And I call this chocolate's dirty little secret, because very few people have heard, if you haven't been to a cacao farm, that chocolate is a fermented food. So to me, this is the most important part of the entire process, even though it probably looks the least appetizing. But this is where about 3/4 of the flavor of the final chocolate bar comes in, is during this ferment. And traditionally, it's done in a wood bin covered with banana leaves, stirred every day for about 5 to 10 days. And that during that process, the fruit kind of drips off as it's consumed. The sugars in that are consumed by the microbes, and it will drip out the bottom, and we try to collect it because it's so delicious. It's called miel de cacao, or honey of the cacao, because it's so sweet. And then the bean gets transformed from a very bitter seed, if you've ever had it before it's been fermented, into this delicious, aromatic, chocolatey smelling bean with much less bitterness and astringency. Then after about a week of that, it goes into the drying, aging process. So this is usually done out on screens in the sun, hopefully be able to quickly cover it if it rains. And this can take anywhere from a few days to a few weeks, depending on the rain at this stage. And then it gets aged. This is probably the longest part of the process, after harvesting, for about at least 6 weeks. We like to do that drives off some of the stronger kind of vinegary flavors that develop during the ferment. Sometimes we've done it for up to 3 years. So kind of like wine or a good bourbon, cacao and chocolate has to be aged to make a great tasting final chocolate product. It's not something you hear about chocolate very often. So then when we taste it and decide it's ready to go on to the next stage, we'll roast it in something looking a lot like a coffee roaster, or sometimes we do it in a convection oven. And this is when it really starts to smell great. And one of the unfortunate hazards of the job of being a chocolate maker is that I can't smell chocolate anymore. It's really sad. People come into our chocolate factory and they say, "Oh my God, it smells so great in here." I'm like, I'll have to take your word for it. I can't really smell anything. But this part I can still smell. So I love the roasting process. And I have to leave the chocolate factory for 2 weeks or more to be able to regain my smell for chocolate. So then after roasting, which does two things, it develops the kind of toasty flavor of the cacao, but it also puffs up the shells of the cacao bean, which makes it a lot easier in this next stage, the cracking, which crushes the bean, and we want to separate out the papery shell. It's a little bit like a peanut in that it has a papery shell. So when you get nibs at the grocery store, cacao nibs, those have already had the cacao shell removed because they're not great for eating. They can have some of the bad stuff in chocolate. You may have heard about lead and cadmium toxicity in certain big brand chocolates in the last couple of years. I'll get into that in a second because I heard there are some questions about that. But also, if the cacao is dried out in the fields in the sun, it might have bird poop on it. So we want to get rid of that for sure, even though it's been roasted. But we don't tend to buy cacao from people who dry out on the ground. We only buy cacao from people who dry it in raised beds to avoid the issue of bird poop on the cacao shell. So we have our most Willy Wonka looking gadget here called the winnower, which uses a shop vac to pull off the lighter shell, kind of like winnowing rice in the wind or with a fan, or winnowing wheat, any kind of similar grain that you're trying to winnow a papery shell off of. And then in the bucket at the bottom, we get the nibs. And if it's from a really good batch of cacao that we know has been dried cleanly, we make a delicious cacao shell tea out of that, which if you come to Hawaii, you can order on our website, madrechocolate.com. Is a really surprising and delightful way to drink cacao that's quite different from hot chocolate because there's no fats in the cacao shell. So you can make an iced tea out of it. So it's great for if you want a chocolatey drink in the summer. You try to ice hot chocolate, it gets all lumpy from all the cocoa butter in there. But if you use a cacao shell tea, it's not only works great as an iced tea, it goes excellent in cocktails. So you can make a chocolate martini with that. And it is quite stimulating. So the shells are very rich in the stimulant part of cacao, which people commonly think is caffeine, but chocolate and cacao only have a tiny bit of caffeine. They mostly have theobromine, which you might see in the necklace around my neck. Is the molecule for theobromine, which is a stimulant found pretty much only in cacao, a little bit in yaupon or black drink from the southern US, and a tiny bit in tea too, but cacao is the highest in theobromine, which is a less jittery high than caffeine that you get from coffee or tea. So we save the shell in cases of good chocolate. Then we'll refine or conch it in a giant chocolate maker. You'll see these 5 or 7 roll refiners. We use a slightly smaller conch. This is our test one. Our main one is about the size of a washing machine. So we'll throw the nibs in there for another 2 to 5 days to grind them really smooth. You need to get it down less than 20 microns in size. That's when the chocolate tends to get really nice and smooth and you don't feel any of the grit left over. And this is the stage where we'll add sugar, cocoa butter, and vanilla to the grinder to grind that smooth as well. So this is when it finally starts to look like chocolate and taste like chocolate with the added sweetness from the sugar. And it has to be here for at least a day, sometimes several, to get that smoothness, which we really pride ourselves on at Madre. Then, if none of those stages sounded really tough, we have to do what I call the dark art of chocolate making, the tempering process. And if any of you have done this at home, you might know why it's so hard to do, because you cannot temper chocolate if it is more than 50 degrees humidity. out. And if you've been to Hawaii, you might know that it is pretty much always 50% humidity or above, you often like 80% humidity. So this is generally why chocolate historically has not been made in the same place where it grows. The cacao tree needs a lot of rain, at least 60 inches a year of rain, and warm temperatures above 56 degrees to grow well. But it's really hard to temper chocolate in those same conditions. So we have to do this in a air-conditioned, climate-controlled shop. And if it's really pouring out, we might have to cancel tempering for the day. And you might ask, well, why are you doing this insanely hard process? I was trying to see if I had any untempered chocolate at home. This is kind of if you can still see my camera, this is an okay representative of untempered chocolate where it doesn't have that nice shine, but you may have gotten some at the store that had kind of a dull matte finish to it. And it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just gone through temperature fluctuations and shipping. Oh, I'm going to have to eat this piece of chocolate. It's melting in my hands because it's out of temper. Sorry, short chocolate eating break. Got to keep fueled. So the tempering turns that matte finish of the chocolate into a nice shine that you expect on chocolate. So here's a bar of well-tempered chocolate. This is one of my favorite, our bourbon chocolate bar. It has that shine that you'd expect from good chocolate. And to do that, you have to heat it and cool it and heat it again in the low humidity conditions. And then it gets, finally, when it's gone through that, which takes about half an hour, it gets poured into chocolate bar molds, vibrated on a vibrating table to get out air bubbles, thrown in the fridge for about 30-40 minutes to cool and solidify. Then we can pop them out of the mold and wrap them finally. And then only 2 months after harvesting our cacao pod off the tree, we finally have a finished chocolate bar that you can eat. So that's the long process. And if you come to Hawaii, you can come on one of our cacao farm tours. If you really want to get into it, we have a cacao boot camp about once a year, which is about 5 days of doing stuff like this. So now that you know the chocolate making process from bean to bar, we can take a short break on and see if there's any questions on that. Oh, you wanted a close up of my
Yeah, let's
theobromine
get it. There we go.
necklace? Can you see it there? It is very closely related to caffeine and theophylline that are also found in tea. And this is made by a biochemist turned jeweler friend, Raven Hanna, who runs Made with Molecules on the Big Island, if you want to get one for yourself. She does serotonin and capsaicin, the spicy part of chilies too. Were there any other questions about the chocolate making process that
Oh
I missed?
yes. Oh yes.
Okay.
We got a couple of questions going on here. The miel de cacao.
Mm-hmm.
Miel de cacao. Can you pronounce that for me one more time, Dr. Bletter? Miel de cacao. Is
You
that
got
right?
it. Yeah, the cacao. Yeah, Spanish for
Alrighty.
honey, basically.
Now is it used for anything else or is it sold as a product? How else do people use it?
Um, People have tried, and for a while on the mainland, there was a company called Repurposed Pod that was selling juice,
Mm-hmm.
bottled pasteurized juice, and it did well for a while, but they had to pasteurize it, of course, to make it a mass market thing,
Okay.
and that ruined a lot of the flavor of the really fresh, bright, fragrant flavor of it. It kind of dulled it and made it just taste like a kind of mundane juice. So I don't think it was as popular in the pasteurized form. And there's another company that I forget, they're called Blue, not Blue Sky, not Blue Bottle. That's a coffee company. There's something with blue in the title.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they have tried to do the same thing recently, and some people are Blue Stripes. Thank you, Maddie, for filling in. I haven't had their version of it, so I can't comment on how theirs tastes compared to the other one. But we make fruit leather out of it, which is really delicious. And I believe we're the only people in the world that sell a fruit leather. So even if you don't live in I see Raven's on the line. That's great. I'm glad she's here. So she can hear me touting her amazing jewelry.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
so we make a fruit roll up or fruit chew from the cacao fruit, so you can get it out of the tropics and get it to the mainland, and we'll ship that to the mainland too if you can't come here. But we also put it in our most famous chocolate bar, the triple cacao, which is the only bar in the world, I think, with the cacao fruit in it and cacao nibs. So you get 3 flavors, 3 textures, all from the cacao. So you get the nibs, chocolate, and cacao fruit. And that's that bar that you might have heard me crunching on when I melted it in my hand. So that's where the fruit usually winds up. But it is more often than not, it is not saved by the farmers, and they just let it run out onto the ground, unfortunately. So we try to teach all the farmers that we work with here in Hawaii to save it. And you have to freeze it right away, or it will start fermenting itself and turn into like a wine or vinegar. And usually when we get back to them a month or 2 after harvest, like, oh, did you save any of that melted cacao for us? And they're like, oh yeah, I totally saved all of it. But then I drank it all because it was so delicious, or I make cocktails or popsicles out of it. So I don't have any to sell you. So at least it gets used, but we don't get a lot of the local stuff, unfortunately.
It's really cool to hear though that through this process, it sounds like at every step, the cacao, or whether it's the pods, or they have a job to do, right? There's something that can be done with every part of this process. Nothing goes to waste. And that brings us to a question about sustainability. But one of our audience members is interested in more sustainable farming of the cacao, and we kind of heard one, like, part of it is using everything. But do you have some other pointers as far as more sustainable farming of cacao? And one of the examples, really quickly, that they brought up was like Smithsonian's bird-friendly chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any
that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one of the main reasons we're called Madre Chocolate, is caring for Mother Earth and trying to do everything sustainably. So like I mentioned, we use the shell for tea. A lot of chocolate companies, at least, 10, 15 years ago, were just throwing out that shell that they thought they couldn't use, or maybe selling it for mulch. But when it was the use of the shell for tea is relatively new discovery in the last maybe decade or 2. So we put that shell to use for tea, and it flies off our shelves. We can't keep that in stock enough when people taste it, and they're so amazed at how chocolatey it tastes when it looks like a weak tea in appearance. Then the pods on the outside, you can maybe see a blurry picture behind me here of some cacao pods on the ground. This is a farm in Solomon Islands that I visited.
That's a lot of cacao pods.
Yeah, that's a pretty big farm. Probably bigger than any in Hawaii right now, except maybe Dole. So those are generally returned to the soil and act as both fertilizer for the plants, and probably more importantly as a habitat for the midge that I mentioned, that is the only one that can really pollinate that flower well. So they, unlike bees, they can't fly very far, maybe only about 300 meters or so. What would that be? 600 feet. So they like to live right under the cacao trees. So to give them a really short commute time, we try to pile up leaves of the fallen tree. We don't rake or blow the leaves out from under the cacao. Leave the leaves. That's the most important lesson I teach to all first-time cacao farmers. A clean cacao farm is an unproductive cacao farm. So a great way towards sustainability is to keep your farm dirty, at least with cacao leaves and pods. And then the other thing on sustainability, there was a question about the bird safe chocolate. There's been, especially in Brazil, where they got hit really badly by cacao fungus pest called witch's broom or vela de bruja, that reduced their chocolate cacao production by, I think, over 70%. So when I was down there last in 2002, they had to bring in cacao from Indonesia to run through their chocolate factories because they weren't growing enough. And all the government researchers were trying to use, I think, genetically modified cacao or traditional breeding to breed a witch's broom resistant cacao. But this farmer discovered this process. Why am I spacing on the name? Maybe someone in the chat can remind me of this farmer method of just having really high diversity in the fields of different non-timber forest products. So they included other things like pau de Brazil, medicinal trees. It has a Portuguese name that I'm spacing on that starts with the C. Not campesino, that's Spanish, but it sounds like that. And they did some studies of this, and they found that the bird and wildlife diversity went up significantly in these very plant diverse cacao farms. So they decided to scrap the government breeding program and just spread this idea of the, not kabuka, it'll come to me by the end of the talk.
It'll by the end of the talk or in the middle of the night, like it happens with me.
So focus on diverse cacao farms, which is often kind of hard to find. There's a wild cacao from Bolivia called Alto Bene Silvestre cacao that a few chocolate makers use in the States.
Is it syntropic farming? That's what Maddie asked.
That's not the term I was thinking of, but it is kind of a similar philosophy. And it does definitely naturally grow as a shade tree. I see a few people mentioning that, kind of like coffee. It can grow in the sun, but it has a much shorter life. So some people try to push it and grow it in the sun, especially in Hawaii, where it's relatively cold for cacao. But I would advocate growing it in the shade for sure.
Okay. Well, it looks like we are ready for part 2 of your talk. For terroir. And then maybe just we can ask it now or toward the end. But inquiring minds want to know about how many beans go into a bar. So that's a pretty significant number, I can imagine.
56.
Whoa.
56 beans. So it's about 1.5 cacao pods per bar of chocolate. Okay. All right. So now we're getting into the terroir part of the talk. So since you may not have all heard this word, which is borrowed from French and wine making, it is just the fancy French word for terrain or land. And it's the idea that if you grow a crop in different places, even if it's the exact same variety, it will produce very different tasting wines. So the idea came up that, if you grow a Pinot Noir, if you make a Pinot Noir the same way, but the Pinot Noir grapes are grown in France versus Oregon versus California versus Australia, it'll produce completely different tasting wines. And it's usually the idea comes from the wind, rain, sun, temperature fluctuations, and neighboring flora and fauna that are affecting this flavor or terroir. And it can be used to describe cacao, coffee, you may have heard of it, any kind of crop that has significantly different subtle taste depending on where it's grown. If you're an expert, you could probably pick up terroir in anything, even like broccoli, but I'm not enough of a broccoli expert to be able to detect terroir, but I can definitely detect it in cacao and chocolate. And usually when people are talking about terroir, they're talking about these macroscopic effects of the soil and fertilizer and the climate. And of course, a lot of it comes from the cacao variety too. There are about 12 main recognized varieties of cacao from the Amazon that have been hybridized over the centuries. So there's many more depending if you go to other countries and how well they've preserved these original varieties versus hybridizing them for their local area and climate. But then I think the most important part of terroir is really from the fermentation, which I mentioned briefly, but I'll go deeper into that now. And you've all heard of probably Hawaii 5.0, but since Hawaii is what we call the North Pole of cacao, one of the coldest places in the world where cacao is grown. So normally it's grown about 20 degrees latitude north and south. Let me see if I can bring up the map of cacao growing regions to elucidate that. So 20 degrees north and south is the normal cacao growing region, whereas most of Hawaii, except for parts of the Big Island, like where I think Raven and Maddie are actually within that. The rest of us, like me up here on Oahu, we're at more like 21 degrees. So we jokingly call Hawaii the North Pole of cacao. And for you guys in the cold on the mainland right now, especially, it might be hard to think of Hawaii as cold for anything. But cacao is originally from the heart of the Amazon, where it probably never gets below 90 degrees, even in their winters. And in Hawaii, we get down to the freezing cold temperatures of like 56, 54 degrees, even sometimes in more mountainous areas in the winter. And that might not sound cold to all you mainlanders, but you quickly become adopted here. And when you first arrive in Hawaii and you see people putting on sweaters in the winter, you think they're crazy. But the next year you're doing the same thing. And the cacao trees kind of need to do that too. So we have to do a few tricks to keep them happy here. Usually if you grow the cacao on the windward or let's see, on the east side of the islands, they will be pretty happy grown on the windward or rainy side of the islands. But it's more the fermentation that can be really difficult in these cold temperatures. That's why I was asking if anyone had fermented cacao before, because this is where we have to take a lot of measures to make sure that it's happy. So if you've fermented stuff like yogurt or kimchi or kombucha, you might notice that in the summer versus the winter, it can act very different. And so all the microbes that are responsible for the fermentation of cacao, they're used to I'm trying to get my browser back up. They're used to, pretty warm Amazonian temperatures for their fermentation. So here in the North Pole of cacao, we have to do a few tricks to get the stuff to ferment well and not go on strike. Because if the microbes responsible for the ferment go on strike, the mold and spore-forming fungus will move in, and that tastes really, really terrible. I've put a lot of weird ingredients in my chocolate over the years just to experiment, from smoked marlin to sun-dried tomatoes to even making a curry chocolate bar. But I can tell you one thing that does not taste good in chocolate is mold. I've unfortunately had to taste some moldy chocolate, and it's pretty awful. So you definitely want to avoid that in your fermentation. So we came up with the Hawaii 5i to get a good ferment. So idling, inoculation, incubation, insulation, and increased volume. So this is idling, letting the cacao pods sit for a few days to dry out a touch, which lets more oxygen in and makes some of the aerobic or oxygen-needing microbes a little happier. We inoculate it often with banana leaves or cacao pods, or sometimes even a vinegar or yogurt that we made locally to sort of act as a probiotic and get it set on the right path for fermentation. We'll often incubate it, put it with like a little light bulb to keep it warm and trick it into thinking it's still in the Amazon, and it's nice toasty 90 or 100 degrees instead of our freezing cold 56-degree winter temperatures here, when we often have to do a ferment. And the insulation is part of that same thing, keeping it nice and warm and toasty. And then the last one, increased volume, is doing a large batch, at least like a meter cube of cacao ferments at a time, which requires several hundred pods harvest at once. And kind of like if you've ever done a compost and you only had a little bit, like if you only have a cubic foot of material, it's not really going to warm up much, and the microbes aren't going to be happy. Whereas if you do a large compost, it'll stay warm even in the dead of winter. So we're trying to accomplish the same thing with increased volume ferment. So a lot of people in Hawaii, they may only have one cacao tree in their backyard. And they're trying to ferment, 5 to 10 pods at once that they were able to harvest. And they don't really have that increased volume, which can make a good ferment pretty tough when you have a small batch. But usually if you have 3 or 4 of these 5 eyes, you should get a reasonable ferment. So we try to spread this, another one of the mnemonics that we came up with. But if you do this right, to borrow a phrase from my former career in Silicon Valley, we try to turn a bug into a feature. I don't know if you've all heard that expression. And so we're using the bug of trying to grow and ferment cacao in the North Pole of cacao. But if you do it correctly with some of these 5 eyes, you can get a really amazing tasting cacao with great mouthfeel, because it has a much higher fat content when you grow the cacao in a cold region. So normally a cacao bean has about 50% cocoa butter and 50% cocoa powder. I saw someone asking earlier about where cocoa butter comes from, and is basically pressed out of the bean, and you only get about half the bean being made of cocoa butter. Normally, if you're close to the equator, it's about that, maybe even as low as 45% cocoa butter. Whereas here in the North Pole, the poor cacao beans have to put on an extra layer of blubber to stay warm through our cold Hawaiian winters. So they will develop a lot more cocoa butter when you're further from the equator. So here, our cacao beans that we've had tested have up to about 60% cocoa butter. So just making a chocolate from Hawaiian grown North Pole cacao beans, you naturally get a much smoother mouthfeel, lower bitterness, because you have less of that bitter cocoa powder half of the bean in there. And it just tastes much creamier and smoother and sweeter, basically, because of less of the bitterness. So that's how we've succeeded in turning that bug into a feature. And now Hawaii has won, I think, 4 international Cocoa of Excellence awards for some of the best cacao in the world, including several of the cacaos that we work with. So that's how we strive through the difficulty of growing cacao in the North Pole. And for those of you that are into fermentation, I could go down many rabbit holes on this. I'll try to touch on it lightly. But cacao fermentation is one of the most complicated food ferments in the world. I've talked to a food fermentation scientist from Harvard, and she said, oh yeah, it blows away even like not only wine or beer fermenting, but like blue cheese and kombucha. So wine and beer only have 1 species of microbe in there, Saccharomyces yeast. Blue cheese has maybe 2, a lactobacteria and a yeast in there. But cacao has 3 entire families of microbes that are responsible for the ferment. They have 3 genera of yeasts, some lactobacteria that produce lactic acid, like in yogurt or sauerkraut or poi that you may have had in Hawaii, and acetic acid bacteria that produce vinegar, or in a sourdough you'll find some of that. And sorry, that's not in sourdough, that's a lactobacillus, but in kombucha has acetic acid bacteria in it too. So, and you not only have 1 species, but you usually have like 5 to 10 species from each of these families. So it's an entire ecosystem that's responsible for the ferment of the cacao. And so this is why if you ever have a good bar of chocolate, don't thank me as a chocolate maker. You should thank the farmer who did this hard fermentation work. Because if they're doing a good job of fermentation, then it's really easy for us as chocolate makers to make good chocolate. We just have to let it shine and really show off the good flavor that they've developed in there. And they're monitoring it and stirring it every day, going through those 5 eyes to make sure that they get a nice ferment, enjoying all the miel de cacao. And I don't want to get sidetracked because I can talk for days about fermentation. That's one of the main things that I've researched in my 15 years of growing cacao and processing it in Hawaii, because I want to get to the terroir part of the talk. So maybe I'll take a brief break here to see if there's any quick questions about the fermentation. Here's some cut open and fermented beans, and Maddie and I have collaborated on the Hawaii Cacao Awards that we started about 8 years ago because I didn't feel like the Hawaiian farmers were getting the recognition they deserve for their amazing work on the cacao fermentation. So we now get like 10 to 20 submissions a year from cacao farmers. And so we have to cut those open, taste them, inspect them. And we're usually looking for less of this purple color that happens in the early stages of the fermentation, more of the brown color you see in the beans in the top right. And more of the openings of the fissures is another good sign of a good fermentation. And there's also different varieties you can see here on top are probably mostly, this is from Mexico, from Chiapas, I believe. We went down there and worked with some of the cacao farmers. The ones on top are probably mostly Forastero cacao beans, and the lighter white ones on the bottom are Criollo, which is a very special variety of cacao. I call it the diamond of cacao. It's a lot harder to grow, more disease susceptible, less productive, but it has amazing taste, and it makes what we call the gateway chocolate, which is, even when it's a dark chocolate, it tastes like a milk chocolate, and we use that to turn milk chocolate lovers to the dark side because it has much less of the bitter antioxidants in there. So you can see it has a much lighter color and needs to be fermented slightly differently. Let me.
This is such an incredible process. So, Dr. Bletter, we do have one question about fermenting, and it's really about the process of fermenting. One of our participants would like to know how this whole process was discovered, and who would have thought that fermenting seeds would be needed, and now you're able to get chocolate from it.
That's a great question. That's actually how I got interested in chocolate. Initially, I was forced to write a book chapter when I was in grad school on traditional uses of cacao, and I went down a 3-year rabbit hole digression for my main thesis on medicinal plants in the Peruvian Amazon, and because I got really interested in this exact question of how did people figure out these many stages that it takes to turn very bitter raw cacao bean into something as delicious as chocolate. So at the time when I wrote that, we didn't know that the seed was used in South America in pre-Columbian times. A few years ago, it was discovered that the Moche people, the predecessors to the Inca in Ecuador about 5,000 years ago, were already using the seed instead of just the fruit. But that still kind of explains parts of how they discovered the fermentation, because it was thought people were enjoying the fruit and making a wine or beer or vinegar out of it. So they already had that fermentation process going, and then they just needed to taste the bean, which they've been throwing out maybe for millennia. I sometimes get sad thinking about how many delicious cacao beans were thrown out after fermentation and never made into chocolate. But I can only rectify that by making more chocolate now.
There you go.
So they had to taste that bean, like, oh, this tastes much better now that it's been fermented, and I actually got a nice buzz. And so my hypothesis was that this was a cultural niche that wasn't filled by other plants or easy to use plants in the area. So most other places where cacao grows, they have caffeine or other stimulant containing plant like mate or guayusa that has high levels of caffeine in it, or guaraná, if you've heard of that, from Brazil, which is a very popular caffeine-containing drink from a lychee relative in Brazil. They had coca in a lot of parts of the Amazon and the Andes if they wanted to wake up. There's some relatives of the hibiscus that have ephedrine or speed in them, basically, that are smoked in some parts of Mexico to wake up. So everywhere else except in the most northern parts of the Amazon, they had a very easy to use product to wake up. And this is, just a cultural niche that all societies need. We need to be able to wake up and get through our day, whether it's hard or easy. So we always seek out, plants or other forms of stimulants in our environment to get through the day. And if you have, something like guaraná, where you just have to grate the seed of the guaraná into a cup of water with your handy dried piranha tongue. I mean, you all have a dried piranha tongue on your Swiss Army knife, right? Like I do.
Of course.
So that was really easy, much easier for them to do than doing this whole fermentation and drying and grinding. They weren't making it into chocolate bars, but they're still making it into drink, which needed about 6 of the 12 steps that I mentioned. So why spend, days making a stimulating cup of chocolate if you can do a cup of guaraná in a few minutes instead? So it's probably only in areas where they didn't have access to those easy to use stimulant plants, and they're already doing the fermentation, since they were probably making a wine or beer from the fruit. That answers that question about how the fermentation process was discovered. Just like in beer or wine, it's probably in stages of just people leaving things out and like, oh, this tastes better after it's been out for a few days.
A lot of experimentation. I can imagine. We have, can you believe this? We have 6 minutes left, Dr. Bletter. 6 minutes.
How much?
6 minutes.
6
We have
minutes?
6
Okay.
minutes left.
Should I run through the terroir quickly then?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
All righty.
So this is the title of the talk, and now you've seen all the stages that go into making chocolate. You can see how much the flavor can change just depending on where it's grown in the world, or even where it's grown in Hawaii. So I'll quickly go through the terroir of different areas. And I was sort of breaking down terroir into 2 areas. I first mentioned the macro terroir, all the effects from the weather and the soil. And then a term I think I may have coined of micro terroir is more the flavor that comes from the ferment, which I think is overwhelming in the chocolate because the ferment is not very controlled in cacao, whereas the ferment is quite controlled in things like wine or beer brewing. So with such a natural ferment, we can't really compare the flavor differences from the soil as much as we can from the ferment. So I'd say most of this flavor differences comes from the microbes in different areas. So in South America, you get where cacao is native to, you get very spicy, floral, kind of fruity, deep chocolate flavors. Central America, we've experienced more kind of olive, Kalamata olive, even astringent flavors. They do a slightly shorter ferment in many parts of Mexico. In the Caribbean, which is the largest Latin American exporter of cacao right now, Dominican Republic, has very dried fruit nut notes. West Africa, which is the largest exporter of cacao in the world, like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, have bitter astringent flavors. probably mostly because of the variety they grow there, the Forastero, and that they do a very short ferment. So it's quite bitter, and this is where the big chocolate manufacturers are getting their cacao from, and that's why they have to add so much sugar and milk to make it taste good, because they're using very short fermented bitter varieties. But there is also great cacao that comes from other parts of Africa, like Tanzania, Uganda. And I was just talking to Courtney about her visit to Kenya, and there's some cacao that grows in southern Kenya that I'd really like to turn into chocolate. So there's some people focusing on a better ferment in parts of Africa. Madagascar is renowned for its very raisiny tasting chocolate. I'm not a huge fan of it because I find it kind of monotone, but a lot of people go bonkers for it. Southeast Asia, which is probably second to West Africa in terms of exporting cacao around the world, has a very hazelnutty note if it's well fermented. We've gotten some amazing cacao from Sumatra and Java that tasted like Nutella straight, without adding any hazelnuts, because it had such a strong hazelnut note just from their terroir. I've gone to and taught cacao growing and fermenting and chocolate making in Melanesia, which includes Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, and New Caledonia. And there they are known for their very smoky, almost leathery tasting chocolate. And this is mostly from the smoke drying process. So we tried to work with them to set up more solar dryers, which are much healthier and easier for them to use. And they can double or triple the selling price of their cacao if they remove the smoke drying process. And it had amazing, nice dried fruit notes hidden underneath that smoky layer. So we've made some great Solomon Islands and Vanuatu chocolate from that. Then cacao is being grown in little bits in northern Australia and Queensland, but I've tasted a few of these bars, but it's still too young to say exactly what their terroir is. And then if you zoom in on this little island in the middle of the Pacific that I'm on, Hawaii, we're just on that border of that 20-degree latitude growing zone. And we have very renowned for our fruity flavor of our cacao here. Sometimes a kind of spicy cinnamon flavor, and if it's not well fermented, mushroomy flavor. And if we zoom into Hawaii, can even get further divisions. There's that 20-degree latitude line going through Hawaii Island. So up here, I'm in Honolulu. We're at 21 degrees, and there's a saying in Hawaii: if you don't like the weather where you are, just go 100 meters over to the next valley and it'll be completely different. And the same is kind of true of the taste of cacao. So I made chocolate from 2 farms on Big Island that were less than a mile apart. Same variety of cacao they're growing there, a Trinitario, which is very popular here. And one tasted like pineapple and black pepper. The other tasted like cinnamon graham crackers. So you can get this amazing variation in taste just going around the Hawaiian Islands. And I wanted to break there, see if there are any final questions before we have to wrap up about terroir or anything else that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, and that is, can you appreciate the unique terroir of cacao better in dark chocolate or in milk chocolate?
It's definitely in dark chocolate, I would say, because when you're making milk chocolate, it is almost always much more dilute cacao flavor. Even a dark milk chocolate is maybe going to have 55, 60% cacao in it, whereas a dark chocolate is going to be 65 up to 100% chocolate. So with more concentrated cacao, you can pick up more of those subtle flavors. And that's why I was saying, like Hershey's, Mars, Nestle, Cadbury's, they have to hide those bitter flavors from the short ferment by diluting it with a lot of milk and sugar. So the some of their chocolate bars only have like 11% cacao, so you can't really taste any differences.
Wow. This has been quite a ride, Dr. Bletters, for sure. Thank you so much.
Glad you
Thank
enjoyed it.
you. Yes, we really did. Thank you all so much for being here with us this evening. If you're in the DC area, please come by and see our own Theobroma cacao tree right there in our garden court. And to learn more about what we got going on for online program offerings, please go to usbg.gov/programs. Dr. Bletter, thank you again. Thank you
My
all
pleasure.
this
Good to see
evening
you
for
all.
being with us. And we'll see you soon.